Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and to discuss how to choose the right contract research organization for your U.S. clinical trial. I imagine if you're all listening today, you have some baby, a drug or a biologic or some technology or device that you've been working on for quite some time and are looking to bring to market ultimately. And as part of your strategy to do so, you're looking to conduct a U.S. clinical trial and would need the assistance of a CRO. So what I'm hoping to do today is give you a general overview of how CROs fit into the FDA regulatory framework, draw some distinctions between how drug and medical device trials are conducted and how the CRO plays a slightly different role in each trial, and then also give you some key questions and tips to use as part of your diligence effort in selecting a CRO for your U.S. clinical trial. A quick overview of our agenda. Just wanted to highlight first why finding the right CRO really matters. And then again, as I mentioned, we'll turn to looking at the question of how CROs fit into the FDA regulatory framework for drug and device trials in the US. And then the three things that I really would encourage anyone to assess with respect to a CRO is the CRO's competence, its capacity, and its compatibility with your organization. So I'm going to walk through each one of those characteristics, and again, just give you some key questions to ask, some things to think about, maybe some things to ask for when you're doing your diligence and interviewing and considering CROs. So first, why does it matter that you find the right CRO for your US clinical trial? Really, there are three really key reasons to get this right, all very important. One, the CRO can help ensure that the study subjects, their health and welfare is protected. A good CRO knows good clinical practice regulations and requirements backwards and forwards, and can really be your partner in ensuring that those subjects' rights and safety and welfare will be protected during the conduct of the study and even after the study is concluded through proper safety reporting procedures. The right CRO can really help with your regulatory compliance as well and reduce a sponsor's enforcement risk for non-compliance with applicable regulatory requirements. A CRO would know, again, really well what the expectations are, what FDA's expectations are, and what they would consider to be good clinical practices for purposes of the US trial. And would also know the ins and outs of FDA regulations and the unique characteristics of what FDA requires in comparison to some other jurisdictions in the world. And then finally, a good CRO can really help to ensure that you have ultimately a successful submission, which is, of course, one of the most important things about why you're conducting the trial to begin with. FDA bases its approval decisions on the data that you're submitting, and to ensure the data is quality data and that the integrity of the data is preserved and good GCP requirements are met, you need to have a good CRO if you're choosing to use a CRO to protect the integrity and quality of the data and to ensure compliance. Without good data and without good compliance, you're not going to end up with a successful submission. So the CRO, again, can be a really great partner for you and ultimately help you get the outcome that you really want. So how do CROs fit into the FDA regulatory framework for drug and device trials in the US? You may have heard this already, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but FDA regulations have pretty detailed requirements. I list here the main ones, although there are other requirements that can be found in other parts of the regulations and in statute. And those would include Part 312, the investigational new drug application, which covers drugs. Obviously, Part 812, investigational device exemptions, which is applicable to devices. Part 50, protection of human subjects, which really deals with informed consent. Part 54, financial disclosure by clinical investigators to ensure there's no conflict of interest. And Part 56, which covers the important procedures that need to be followed by institutional review boards. IND IDE regulations provide the sponsor with exemption from the drug and device pre-market approval requirements and permit shipment of the drug or device for purposes of conducting the clinical trial. And there are certain obligations and restrictions that they put in place to permit sponsors to ship and use the drug or device for purposes of the clinical trial, including obligations related to labeling and promotion, charging for the drug or device, handling protocol amendments, how to handle safety reporting, and then also how to do annual reports. So there are very detailed requirements in those regulations that sponsors would need to follow, and in certain cases, CROs would therefore need to follow as well. Part 50 applies to all clinical investigations that are used to support applications for research or marketing of drugs or devices in the US. Essentially, it requires that the investigator obtain informed consent from research subjects as a condition of their participation in the clinical trial. And there are several elements of informed consent that are set forth in Part 50 that must be complied with. Part 54 applies to applicants for marketing authorization for a covered clinical study, and really is aimed to ensure that any financial interests of clinical investigators as part of the marketing application would be disclosed. IND ID applicants need to collect that information, but are not required to disclose it prior to initiating the study. But you would ultimately provide that information to the agency as part of your submission. Part 56, institutional review boards or IRBs. You need IRB approval generally for a clinical investigation, which must meet the requirements as set forth in Part 56 prior to the submission of the data to FDA. And the IRB has to maintain adequate documentation of IRB activities and retain these records for at least 3 years after completion of the study. And the IRB really approves or decides not to approve the research and considers a number of factors as stated in the regulations in making that determination. So there are very, very detailed requirements in the US that the sponsor must comply with and can lean on a good CRO to ensure that those compliance requirements are met. So how do regulations, or do regulations in the United States specifically address CROs? This is a key distinction between the drug and device regulations. You do see the drug regulations in Part 312 addressing CROs. They define the term contract research organization and importantly authorize the sponsor to transfer any or all of the sponsor's obligations, which we just discussed in the previous slide, for the conduct of the study to the CRO. To do so, the regulation requires that sponsors keep a written statement that outlines what obligations have been transferred, and you really, under the regulation, need to describe the responsibilities of both the sponsor and the CRO once a transfer has been made. And it's required that when the sponsor disclose in their IND whether any obligations have been transferred to a CRO, and if so, that the sponsor lists what those obligations actually are. For your reference, I wanted to include here the two relevant regulations. This one is 312.3, which includes the definition of contract research organization is found in FDA regulations. And it means a person that assumes as an independent contractor with the sponsor one or more of the obligations of a sponsor. That can mean design of a protocol, selection or monitoring of investigations, evaluations of reports, and even preparations of materials to be submitted to the Food and Drug Administration. So any entity that performs one of these obligations or any of the obligations that are outlined in FDA regulations could be acting or would be acting as a contract research organization under this definition. You don't necessarily have to be performing all of the obligations and regulations, but if you're performing any of them, in that case, you would meet the definition of CRO. And then this section 312.52 talks about how to transfer obligations to a contract research organization. And I think it's important to remember here that the transfer does need to be written down, that it will ultimately be disclosed to FDA as part of your submission. And it's assumed that any obligation that's not covered by the written description will not deem to have been transferred. So if you don't specifically mention that the obligation is being transferred to the CRO, the obligation therefore stays with the sponsor. So even though a drug sponsor can transfer the legal obligations under the regulations, the obligation to ensure there's compliance with GCP and the IRB procedures are followed, as well as financial disclosure, and requirements in Part 312, it's really important to remember that a drug study sponsor can't wash their hands of those items that it's chosen to transfer to the CRO, because ultimately the drug sponsor is going to be relying on the data that they're submitting as part of their application. And if that data is not quality data and the integrity of the data has not been preserved, it's ultimately not going to result in a successful outcome for the sponsor. And FDA has made a statement to this effect, saying while a contract research organization may assume any or all of the sponsor's responsibility for the conduct of a study, it should be emphasized that the transfer does not relieve the sponsor from responsibility for the quality and integrity of any data derived from the investigation that are submitted to FDA. So you really do, as a sponsor, want to ensure that procedures are still being followed, especially the ones that are going to impact the quality and the data of the study. So how do the device regulations address CROs? The device regulations handle things differently. They don't define CRO, which was the case in the drug regulations, and they also do not permit the legal transfer of a sponsor's regulatory obligations to a CRO. So therefore, a device study sponsor remains responsible for any of the regulatory non-compliance by a CRO. And similarly to drug study sponsors, device sponsors are also responsible for the quality and integrity of the data that is submitted to FDA. So the practical implications of this, it's a slightly different dynamic between the sponsor and the CRO when talking about a drug versus a medical device trial. A drug CRO can generally act more independently because it's legally responsible for the sponsor obligations identified in the contract. And you'll see drug CROs acting in this fashion, albeit with oversight by a sponsor to ensure that requirements are otherwise being followed and that the data can ultimately be relied on in the submission to FDA. Whereas in the device context, a medical device CRO has to act with less independence and serves really more as a consultant to the sponsor because regulatory obligations legally remain with the sponsor, which, as I mentioned, is different from what occurs in the drug context. So choosing the right CRO for your US clinical trial. The first element that I wanted to discuss was competence. So when speaking about experience, some of the key things to think about here are, does the CRO have experience working in your therapeutic space? If you're working on an oncology drug, you probably you're going to want some CRO that has a lot of experience working in the oncology space. Because of the technical expertise that that CRO has, as well as the contacts that they probably or should have with investigators and sites in the oncology world. Another question to ask is, does the CRO have experience working with drug or device sponsors as applicable? If you have a drug, it would make sense to go to a CRO that has a lot of experience working with drug sponsors. And if you have a device, you would want to go to a CRO that has a lot of experience working with device sponsors, because the nature of the studies are different and the nature of the legal obligations are different. The industries are different. So you want a CRO that really knows the ins and outs of the drug industry or the device industry, depending on your situation. You also want to consider whether the CRO has experience running the type of study you require. There are a lot of different kinds of studies out there, and many different types of studies that need to be run as you progress through the development of a drug or a device. Feasibility proof of concept studies occur very early on. Pivotal studies obviously are the key study to ensure that you would run before submitting to FDA. And then there are sometimes post-marketing studies that need to be completed as well. And each one has its own idiosyncrasies and different things that you would want to think about in conducting one. So you want to ensure that your CRO knows how to do that type of study and has experience doing it previously. Also, does the CRO have the experience needed to grow with you? Some CROs do feasibility studies really well. Some do post-marketing really well. Some do feasibility, pivotal, and post-marketing really well. I think generally you find smaller CROs are more specialized in what they do, but sometimes a bigger CRO, it might be worthwhile to you to work with a bigger CRO that can do all three to build a relationship that could grow as you progress through the stages of development for your product. And one way to help get these questions answered is to talk to the CRO and ask for a client reference list. They should be able to provide you with something to give you comfort that they know your space, they know drugs or devices studies well, and can give you a sense of what types of studies they have experience running. CRO team members. In addition to assessing the CRO as a whole, you would also want to look at the team members. CROs will propose project team members, and you want to ensure that they have the requisite experience for your project. You also want to get a sense of whether the CRO team members have the judgment and insight that you might need to meet your goals. It's not necessarily just their background and what they've done previously, but you want, I mean, at the end of the day, you want someone who has good judgment, who can bring important questions and issues to you and help you problem solve when necessary to ensure that those issues can be worked through. And one way to answer these questions is ask to see the credentials of the proposed project team. A CRO will generally be able to provide something to you. And it's important to remember that studies sometimes can take a while and the project team can change. So while you may love the initial team that's proposed by a CRO, people may leave the CRO for other opportunities or be reassigned to other studies. So oftentimes I advise clients to consider requiring contractually or otherwise that if the members of the originally proposed project team are later replaced, that the new team members have comparable credentials, and that the sponsor can have some say or input over who the new team members are that might be replacing them. This is a really key one too, I think, in assessing CRO competence, and that's, does the CRO have relationships with investigator sites and access to relevant patient populations? One of the real challenges oftentimes in conducting trials is enrolling the right types of patients and finding those patients, and in being able to do so in a timely fashion in accordance with the timelines that you've set forth and believe are realistic. And you want to ensure that the CRO has relationships with productive investigator sites, meaning sites that have access to valuable patients and high quality patient data. And to determine whether the CRO has these types of relationships, I would advise you to ask the CRO to give you a profile of their stable of sites for your particular therapeutic area to get a sense of what sites they're typically working with when conducting a study in your therapeutic space. You can also ask for reports of recruiting by site for the last 3 studies in your therapeutic space to get an idea of how quickly they were able to enroll patients and how fruitful they were in producing the types of patients that you might need for your particular study. You can ask oftentimes for investigator site references to have an opportunity to speak with investigator sites and ask them questions about patient enrollment and also their experience working with the CRO. Obviously, you want to ensure that the sites have good relationships with the CROs. It just makes for a better working relationship overall, and ultimately, I think, can lead to faster enrollment and better outcomes. And then finally, ask the CRO to provide you with an optimistic, a realistic, or a pessimistic subject enrollment schedule. It's obviously impossible to predict with certainty what rate of enrollment you can expect, but it's helpful, I think, to have a range of what's really out there and what the options might be. And so it's good to know what a really fast enrollment might look like, what the enrollment is probably going to look like, and what a worst case scenario might be. So I think that's a helpful question to ask as well. Client service. Does the CRO have a good track record of client service? Obviously, you want to be, you want to feel like the CRO is hearing your concerns and is helping you problem solve and keeping clients happy. The CRO has a history of meeting goals and milestones as determined by clients and agreed to by the CRO. And most CROs will ensure you that they do have a great track record of client service, but I think you can ask the CRO to provide data to support any types of claims that they make regarding meeting client goals and milestones, and again, can ask for client references to get a sense of how the clients perceive their relationship with the CRO. Subcontractors, oftentimes you get a lot of benefit from working with the CRO because of the subcontractors that they work with. And some of them are good, some of them are not so good, but I think it can be really helpful to review, research, and approve CRO contractors, especially when they're key ones that are going to be really crucial for the success of your study. Another way to assess CRO competence is to think about and get a sense of whether the CRO has a good understanding of FDA regulatory requirements and processes in place to ensure compliance. To do that, you can review or ask to review relevant CRO SOPs that are intended and in place to ensure that regulatory compliance is achieved. And you also want to make sure that the CRO has a process in place that provides quality assurance and monitoring that is directly related or linked to compliance with FDA regulations. And you can also get a sense of the history of compliance with FDA regulatory requirements by asking the CRO first if there have been any issues recently or within a certain time period. Ask to have information related to their inspection history. CROs are inspected by FDA, and you can find out what the outcomes of those inspections might be, and certainly ask if there are any enforcement actions that have resulted. That information should probably or should be publicly available, but I think it's always an important question to ask as well. Choosing the right CRO for your US clinical trial, another aspect to think about is the capacity of the CRO to service you. That means a couple of things, but one of them being staffing. Does the CRO have adequate staff to support your unique requirements? And that can mean, does it just have enough people overall, or does the CRO have the right types of people for your needs? You want to ensure that, especially if you're working with a larger CRO and you might be a smaller company, you want to ensure that their staff isn't going to go to all the larger companies that are probably bringing in more business for the CRO and therefore have more power over demanding staff when needed. You want to ensure that they're staffed for everyone who comes in the door of the CRO, and that you're going to get quality people as well. Capacity also relates to infrastructure and whether the CRO has appropriate infrastructure in place to support your project requirements. That can mean something as simple as, do they have adequate facilities? And there are some other unique things to think about. Do they have software programs that you would need or want to track project performance? How is their clinical information system organized? Is it Part 11 compliant? Can the CRO export data securely? You just want to be able to ensure that they have the infrastructure in place to ensure that the study is going to be conducted efficiently and well, and again, in compliance with regulations, to make the submission process ultimately easy and hopefully successful. Choosing the right CRO for your US clinical trial, thinking about compatibility. Does the CRO have experience working well with companies of your size and type? Obviously, there are companies of all different sizes out there at different stages in their life. Some are newer companies with limited funding. Some are large multinational corporations that have been around for quite some time. And each type of company has different needs and have unique opportunities. They can present unique opportunities, but also some hurdles that are unique to the size and type of your organization. And you want to ensure that the CRO understands a company of your size and type and knows where the issues might arise as a result and where the opportunities might arise as a result of your size and type, and has experience working with companies like yours. And you want to know that they're going to be able to problem solve effectively for you, given that they've worked with companies of similar type in the past. It's also important to get a sense of whether you and the CRO are aligned on the importance of values, including the following values that I have listed here. How important to you is regulatory compliance or subject safety, or cost management, data quality and integrity, timeline management? Sometimes these things can conflict, and you want to know that the CRO is going to value the things that you value first when there is a conflict. And I think it's important to ask questions to probe and get a sense of where they really fall and how they rank these values, and ensure that when working with them, that their values are going to be your values as well. It's also important to think realistically about whether the CRO team members are going to be able to act as an extension of your team. This is really about ensuring that the personalities involved mesh well, and that there's chemistry, And when there's not, I think it's appropriate to judiciously ask the CRO to replace team members that are not necessarily a good fit for your organization or your study. And one tip also to think about is sometimes the best cultural fit is with a CRO of comparable size to your company. That's certainly not always the case. But I think oftentimes you'll find similarly sized CROs understand well the needs and challenges of companies of a similar size. And you're not going to be swallowed up if you're smaller by a larger CRO that's also serving large multinational corporations. You want to ensure that your company matters as well. Another compatibility question to ask, are you and the CRO in alignment with respect to expectations and responsibilities? It's so crucial to have a clear exchange of expectations at the beginning of the relationship, and to ensure that responsibilities are defined and that each party knows who owns each aspect of the trial. You want to make sure you're in agreement with respect to deliverables and timelines. It can mean, are you in agreement with processes and technology platforms? It can be very high level, it can be very nitty gritty, but it's important that you think about each of these things and make sure that you and the CRO are in alignment on what those expectations and responsibilities are. And finally, are you and the CRO in alignment with respect to the working relationship? You want to agree and have a sense at the beginning of how involved you, the sponsor, will be. And you want to have a sense that you and the CRO are in agreement over an oversight model that clearly identifies how your company staff will oversee and support the CRO. I don't think it's generally great to take a totally hands-off approach, but at the same time, you don't want to be doing detailed quality assessments of every single thing the CRO does. In fact, that kind of defeats the purpose of having a CRO to begin with. So I think it's really important to try and find middle ground that you and the CRO can both agree on. And that can mean agreeing on the frequency of status reports or teleconferences or other reporting methods. You just want to have a clear idea of what your working relationship will look like so that neither you nor the CRO will be surprised and there won't be any friction down the road. So that's the end of my presentation now. Hopefully I've given you some good things to think about when it comes to CRO selection. If there's something I didn't cover or you have any questions, I've included my email address here, and I would encourage any one of you to reach out to me with additional questions. I wish I could be there or live to answer them in real time, but understanding the nature of the presentation, I do want to make myself available, and again, would encourage you to follow up with any additional questions by emailing me. So thank you again. I'm so flattered to be here with you today. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.